In 1889, Friedrich Nietzsche suffered a mental breakdown. He caused a public disturbance on the streets of Turin in Italy and was apprehended by 2 policemen, but details of what exactly happened that day are unknown. One famous story tells of Nietzsche's embrace of a horse, pitying the poor creature as it was relentlessly whipped by the carriage driver. But the story only surfaced years after the event supposedly took place, and there is no proof that Nietzsche's horse even existed. Additionally, the entire event is reminiscent of a similar scene in Dostoevsky's Crime and Punishment, lending credence to the argument that the entire story is more fiction than fact. Still, whatever happened that day, Nietzsche's declining mental state was undeniable. In the following days, he wrote his so-called Wahnbriefe, or insanity letters, to a number of close friends. He signed these letters not as Nietzsche, but either as Dionysus or the Crucified One. And he made one wild claim after the other. For example, that he had been literally crucified by German doctors, that the Pope should be imprisoned, even that he created the world. The unhinged content of these letters alarmed his friends, and soon afterwards, Nietzsche was admitted to a mental hospital in the German city of Jena. These insanity letters are the last words that Nietzsche ever put to paper. Except that in 1951, a curious little book was published. It was written by Nietzsche during his stay in the mental asylum, and the manuscript somehow stayed hidden and went unnoticed for over 60 years. Through a wild series of events, the manuscript traveled the world and was finally published in New York City. There is only one problem. The book is fake. This is the story of My Sister and I, the literary forgery that is supposed to be Nietzsche's final book. Get yourself a cup of coffee and strap in, because it's a wild one. But first, a fake book written in someone else's name. That sounds like a case of identity theft. And in the current online-dominated world, the danger of identity theft is more real than ever. That brings us to our sponsor, NordPass. NordPass is a password manager that stores all of your passwords in one place so you don't have to memorize them all. It can also generate secure, complex passwords for you. NordPass is a zero-knowledge password manager, which means that your passwords are encrypted. No one except you has access to them, not even the NordPass team. Do you use your Facebook account to log into every website or application because that's more convenient? Well, what happens if someone hacks your Facebook account? Hackers get access to all of the accounts that are linked to your Facebook. They might leak your credit card information or commit identity theft. NordPass offers you the same convenience, but it safely secures your password in an encrypted database. They also offer a handy data breach tool that lets you find out if your online account or credit card information has been leaked anywhere. Get exclusive access to NordPass's best offer by going to nordpass.com/Weltgeist or use the coupon code Weltgeist at the checkout to get 1 additional month for free. Thank you to NordPass for sponsoring this video. Now, back to the book. The book opens with a foreword by Nietzsche translator Dr. Oskar Levi, who translated almost all of Nietzsche's works into English. Of course, depending on who to believe, this foreword is just as fake as the rest of the book. For what it's worth, Oskar Levi's own daughter claimed that her father had nothing to do with the book, that it's all made up. Oskar wasn't alive to confirm or deny the rumors. He died 5 years before the book was published. In any case, in the foreword, Oskar tells the story of how he came into possession of the manuscript. It's a wild tale of immigration fraud involving an American journalist and a Canadian clergyman who now lives in England. The pair had met each other on a boat during a transatlantic trip, and a few weeks after this encounter, the Canadian called upon that very same American journalist. He needed his help. His wife, for some reason or other, needed to join him from England to Canada, and he needed the American to basically defraud immigration services and risk his own life and limb for the passage to the New World. Of course, the American journalist was extremely unwilling to undertake this adventure. He barely even knew who the clergyman was. But that's when he revealed that he was in possession of an as yet unreleased Nietzsche manuscript, an autobiographical work that had somehow escaped public notice for decades. The manuscript, the American was told, would be his. It would be his payment. But the story gets weirder. How did Nietzsche write this manuscript in the first place? And more importantly, how did it end up in Canada of all places. What follows is the story of the manuscript itself, and it takes us back to Jena, to the mental asylum where Nietzsche was admitted. According to the foreword, Nietzsche wrote this book while admitted to a mental asylum. Determined to not let his mother, sister, or friends handle the manuscript, he decided to write it in secret. This part of the story is actually pretty plausible. First of all, we know that Nietzsche's sister heavily edited the work that is now known as The Will to Power, a collection of Nietzsche's final notes. For some scholars, this means that the book is not an accurate representation of Nietzsche's thought. But secondly, even so-called canonical books by Nietzsche were treated in a problematic way by his close circle of friends. For example, The Antichrist was written in 1888, 1 year before his mental collapse. Due to the radical content of the book, Nietzsche's friends decided to delay its publication instead of releasing it immediately. It was published only 6 years later. Even worse, his final work of autobiography, Ecce Homo, was written in the same year as The Antichrist, but only released a staggering 20 years later, in 1809, 8 years after Nietzsche's death. Now, during all this time, his close circle of associates held on to these manuscripts. So from the perspective of the foreword of My Sister and I, Nietzsche's motivations for writing this book in secret, they actually do kind of make perfect sense. He realized that if he wrote this alleged final book in the same way as his other books, there was a good chance that his friends might decide to delay or even cancel its publication. And Nietzsche's concerns are even more valid if you keep in mind how explosive the contents of the book are. But we'll take a look at the contents of the book in more detail later in the video. The point is, the story goes that Nietzsche needed to write in secret. He set about a plan. He struck up a friendship with a fellow inmate, a merchant who, rumor had it, would be among the first of the asylum to be declared cured and set free. This man's son smuggled pen, paper, and ink into the asylum while visiting his father, and it's on this paper that Nietzsche supposedly wrote the manuscript. He then entrusted this merchant with this manuscript, gave him specific instructions on how to get it to a publisher, and promised him that he'd be well compensated for his efforts. By the way, you might be wondering, isn't Nietzsche insane by this point? How could he still write a work of philosophy? The author of the foreword argues that Nietzsche experienced moments of lucidity throughout his madness, and that during these periods of clarity he wrote down the work, taking every opportunity of mental clarity to write down some words. Bit by bit, he finished the manuscript. Whether or not Nietzsche did experience these moments of clarity is a matter of historical debate. Witness testimony seems to be contradictory, with some people claiming that Nietzsche was completely incapable of speaking, let alone writing, while others maintained that he was lucid enough to have discussions about art and music. It could go either way, so let's give the author of My Sister and I the benefit of the doubt, for now. So Nietzsche painstakingly and slowly wrote his final work of philosophy, and entrusted the manuscript to a fellow inmate. What happened next? Well, nothing. According to the foreword, the merchant was only barely literate, and even if he did have a college education, it's unlikely he would have heard about Nietzsche anyway. He took the manuscript and kept it as a curiosity, as a prop, to tell his friends and family about that wacky professor in the asylum who would stride up and down the place, identifying himself with a whole string of famous persons from Napoleon to God. The manuscript might have been lost to history, were it not for the son of the merchant who took it with him when he emigrated to Canada. Not for any particular reason, just on a whim. That is how this German manuscript traveled all the way from an insane asylum in Jena to Canada. But the journey of the manuscript is far from over. It just so happens that this Canadian immigrant soon learned that his employer, the aforementioned clergyman, was interested in old books and manuscripts. He told him about a manuscript in his possession, written by a curious professor in a German insane asylum. The clergyman immediately knew who this mysterious professor would be. He demanded to see the manuscript, and set about comparing the handwriting to other writings by Nietzsche. He compared the manuscript with the published specimens of Nietzsche's handwriting, and that might be forged. But he read and reread, and the style, the matter, the character of Nietzsche, who could forge that? Indeed, who would try? Let's backtrack a little bit. Nietzsche writes the manuscript in Jena. He gives it to a fellow inmate. The son of the inmate takes the manuscript to Canada. There, he sells the manuscript to the clergyman, his employer. And as we mentioned at the beginning of the video, this clergyman would end up giving this manuscript to an American journalist in exchange for his assistance at defrauding the Canadian Immigration Office. And it's this American journalist who wants to enlist Dr. Oscar Levi, famed Nietzsche scholar, to translate this manuscript from German to English. The foreword from which the story is derived is written from the perspective of Dr. Oscar Levi, or at least, lest we forget, someone pretending to be him. So now the foreword takes us to the present day. The manuscript has traveled from Germany to Canada to America. More than 2 years passed in which I almost forgot the young American and the manuscript. Then one morning it arrived. I read it with increasing amazement. Who but Nietzsche could have set out to write such a story? The quote was supposedly written by Dr. Oscar Levi himself, translator of the work. But let's not forget that this book and this foreword were released after his death, and his daughter claimed he had nothing to do with the supposed new Nietzsche book. Still, according to the foreword, the manuscript was translated. And finally, in 1951, the book was published. The reason it took so long was because the publisher wanted to wait until Nietzsche's sister, Elizabeth, who died in 1935, passed away in order to avoid a potential libel lawsuit. Why would the publishers be scared of a lawsuit? Well, the first hint is that the book is called My Sister and I. Let's take a closer look at the contents. My Sister and I is written in the style of Ecce Homo, Nietzsche's only other work of autobiography, unless you count this book, of course. But the tone is much different. As a translator supposedly puts it, the hammer has fallen out of the hand of the author of the Antichrist and is replaced by a clenched, naked fist. It's a testament to the hopelessness of Nietzsche's situation, stuck in a mental asylum despite having moments of clarity, yet not being able to escape its dark halls. The most time is spent on the 3 most important women in his life: Cosima Wagner, Lou Salome, and his sister Elizabeth. Cosima Wagner was the wife of Richard Wagner. Richard and Nietzsche were friends for years in a sort of symbiotic, mutually beneficial friendship agreement. For Nietzsche, he could count himself as part of the inner circle of the undisputed superstar artist of his time. For Wagner, the brilliant young professor Friedrich Nietzsche delivered academic gravitas to his art. It allowed him to boast that not only do the people love his music, the academic elite does as well. It gave his art an extra layer of prestige and cultural significance. They spent many nights discussing music, art, and philosophy, and Nietzsche was fond of Wagner's wife, too. Cosima Wagner features prominently in his personal letters, but nothing really to point to a secret love affair. But in My Sister and I, Nietzsche seems to admit that there was indeed an affair between the two of them. We reiterate again that there is no evidence of such an affair beyond the words written in this book. In all likelihood, Nietzsche did feel love or attraction to Cosima, but it was never reciprocated. That's what the available evidence seems to tell us. The second woman who plays a prominent role in My Sister and I is Lou Salome, a Russian-born psychoanalyst whose life is characterized by a search for a wide range of knowledge. It led her towards friendships with Sigmund Freud and Rainer Maria Rilke, but most importantly, Nietzsche and Nietzsche's close friend Paul Rée. The 3 were in a bit of a love triangle at some point, with both men enamored with Salome, and Nietzsche even proposed to her 3 times. He was thrice rejected. In My Sister and I, Nietzsche often cries out for female attention. A notable quote in this regard is the following: "I want a woman, any woman." But the most important woman is Nietzsche's sister, Elizabeth. The book deals in great explicit detail about their supposed childhoods. And, reader beware, the book contains an admission that Nietzsche and his sister had an incestuous relationship. Suffice to say that the bulk of the controversy around the book hinges upon this admission. It's an explosive declaration, new biographical information that would shed new light on Nietzsche's psyche and even his philosophy. Because Nietzsche, perhaps like no other philosopher before or since, has been psychoanalyzed to death. In the first place, by Lou Salome herself. But Freud also tried his hand, along with Stefan Zweig, Bertrand Russell, Rudiger Safransky, and a long list of biographers. And Nietzsche's life story is of course the perfect breeding ground for such an analysis. Here we have a solitary, mountaineering, brilliant philosopher plagued by ill health all his life, yet espousing a vigorous philosophy of strength, an iconoclastic genius taking the hammer to all Western philosophy before him, living a tumultuous love life, traveling all over Europe, yet preferring to keep to himself, striking up both a friendship and bitter rivalry with the foremost artist of his time, Richard Wagner, all before finally succumbing to a mental illness, source unknown, and spending the remainder of his life in a demented state. Even more interesting is the existence of Ecce Homo, Nietzsche's own autobiography, in which he critically evaluates his own work and life, a work of autobiography that digs so deep it prompted Freud to say that Nietzsche knew himself like no one else knows himself. The shocking revelation in My Sister and I, if true, would put dynamite under everything that was hitherto known about Nietzsche and his life. Of course, there is no proof whatsoever about any of this. It all hinges upon the authenticity of the book itself, which, as we have seen, is doubted heavily. To be very clear, there is no single piece of corroborative evidence to support the various biographical claims made in this very book. By the way, if you expected philosophy from this book, you'll be somewhat disappointed. It's written to be a sort of sequel to Ecce Homo, which was an autobiographical work about Nietzsche's intellectual life, but it was still infused with philosophy. In Ecce Homo, Nietzsche critically examines his body of work and his role in world history. Every sentence breeds philosophy. In this book, not at all. It's mainly about his childhood and his desire for women, which is perhaps the biggest tell of all. There is a small minority, really only a handful of academics, who maintain that My Sister and I is an authentic work by Nietzsche. In my humble opinion, they are mistaken. There's an entire discussion on the historical circumstances under which Nietzsche supposedly wrote this book. Was it possible for him to do, or not? Questions in these discussions are, for example, was Nietzsche lucid enough to write an entire book while stuck in an insane asylum? The story of how the manuscript traveled to America might sound outlandish, but not impossible. In fact, nothing about the book's circumstances, as they are told to us in the foreword, are impossible per se. You can believe they happened, or that they didn't. It's not an argument to merely say that it doesn't sound believable. However, we can look at the text itself. In the foreword, it's claimed 2 times by 2 different people that the writing style of My Sister and I is quintessentially Nietzsche. They ask the rhetorical question, who could possibly fake this recognizable, idiosyncratic style? Well, first of all, the answer is probably a lot of people. But second of all, it's my humble opinion that the writing style of My Sister and I simply isn't Nietzschean at all. A quick glance at the text should reveal this to anyone who's familiar with Nietzsche's works and writing style. Of course, this by its own is not a proof of anything, but let's visit some passages of the work, and hopefully I can convince the viewer of my case. Namely, that this writing style is simply not like Nietzsche at all. So, first of all, there is no German text available for this book, so we have to go by the English version. That's a pretty big red flag already. Second of all, proponents of this book will dismiss any criticism of the style preemptively, with a caveat that Nietzsche wrote these passages on the thin line between lucidity and insanity. Personally, I believe that's a cop-out argument, a convenient excuse, but of course, it's up to each individual to decide. But let's go through some examples. Let's start with the very first sentence of the book. I had a dream last night. Or should I say a nightmare? A nightmare is something which rises out of the subconscious into the conscious, loaded with shock and unpleasantness, to punish or frighten us. Can you spot the suspect term in this passage? I'll give you a second if you want to figure it out. The strange term here is subconscious, used as a noun. It is true that the word subconscious appears in some translations of real actual works by Nietzsche, like the Genealogy of Morals. But the word in that context is not a noun but an adjective. And the original German word by Nietzsche in this context is unterirdisch, which literally means subterranean or underground. The word subconscious, used as a noun, recalls psychoanalysis and the works of Sigmund Freud. Freud himself used the term early on, but later disavowed it in favor of the term unconscious. But a mix-up between subconscious and unconscious is a very common mistake, especially among people who aren't very familiar with Freud's works. And indeed, most people today would probably use the word subconscious when they really mean unconscious in the Freudian sense. And this first passage about Nietzsche's supposed nightmare is precisely extremely Freudian in nature. Freud even wrote a famous work on the interpretation of dreams. But of course, here's the thing. Freud didn't invent psychoanalysis until 4 years before Nietzsche died, and his theories wouldn't become popular for years afterwards. There is simply no way that Nietzsche read Freud, let alone was influenced by him. In my personal estimation, it's much more likely that whoever wrote My Sister and I was indeed familiar with Freud's theories, at least to the extent that basically everyone is familiar with Freudian terms such as the unconscious, or the more common but mistaken term, subconscious. And without much second thought, he used the psychoanalytic term in this book, a Freudian slip, if you will. But there is more. It's not just the first passage. In almost every single passage, there's just a phrase or a word that rings some alarm bells. I who have reached duty to truth above all other duties. Would Nietzsche really say this? If anything, Nietzsche preached a duty to joy or even to power. Nietzsche is in fact a heavy skeptic of truth, especially truth with a capital T, absolute truth. Moreover, the word duty calls to mind Kantian associations, and we know how Nietzsche thought about Kant's categorical imperative, his duty-based morality. Or how about this one? I have been a rebel against the universe, and the universe has wreaked its vengeance upon me. Nietzsche has never been a rebel against the universe. In fact, he embraced this world. He wanted us to embrace it too. His rebellion was against philosophies and religions who thought this universe wasn't worth much, who constructed otherworldly hinterwelds that were more important than the material world of the here and now. Nietzsche was in many ways the exact opposite of a rebel against the universe. In fact, he'd call Christians and Platonist philosophers rebels against the universe. Certainly not himself. And consider the following passage. Is this really Nietzsche, or a parody of him by someone who knows Nietzsche decently well, yet not good enough to completely emulate his style? Without my sister, my genius might have been blighted in early youth when I first realized that God was dead and that we were trapped in a whirling void, a meaningless chaos of being. This just doesn't sound like Nietzsche at all. It's hard to put into words exactly why that is, but the use of the word void, which appears quite often in the text, is a big clue. And the word meaningless too, as well as the entire tone and structure of the sentence. Honestly, it sounds like how a 14-year-old who has just read Nietzsche would write about Nietzsche, not like the man himself would write. And that goes for pretty much the entire book. It's just so edgy. Spirits soar to the stars, the wild spirits who have been hellbound, trapped in the vomit of incestuous desire. Oh, singing birds of my hopes, where are you now? Your throats are cut and your blood gushes out upon the dry desert sands. These are just a few examples. The book is filled with them. It simply doesn't sound convincing. Now, one of the main points. The book is entirely about how Nietzsche basically disavows himself and becomes anti-Nietzsche, even to the point of hinting at a conversion to Christianity. He talks about how he was wrong to mock God, to think that love is not the center of the universe, that pity is a virtue after all. He speaks in terms of sin and forgiveness. In short, he says he was wrong about everything. He laments that he is about to die. He feels his end coming near. And to be honest, some of these passages are pretty touching. But those passages are only here to highlight Nietzsche's so-called conversion. His fear of death pushes him towards some kind of acceptance of Jesus. Proponents have called My Sister and I a stylistic and tonal complement or opposite of Ecce Homo. Megalomania versus modesty. Bold proclamations versus nuanced arguments. Antichrist versus anti-Nietzsche. To me, it just sounds like it was written by a Christian who tried to put words in Nietzsche's mouth and claim him for the Christian camp. Imagine if 50 years after his death, there surfaces an as yet unknown book by Schopenhauer, in which he claims he was wrong about the world being both will and representation, that he was a fool for centering his morality around compassion, that in fact he doesn't think animal welfare is important at all, that there is no wisdom at all to be found in the Sanskrit texts. That is pretty much what this book is, but with Nietzsche's philosophy. In other words, it just sounds too good to be true. How convenient that one of Christianity's greatest opponents, suddenly on the brink of death, renounces his godless ways and embraces Christ. How convenient that all his earlier books are denounced by their own author. There are no real arguments in My Sister and I, just confessions, thoughts, biographical information. If there is anything close to an argument found within these pages, it's about political philosophy, but these bring their own set of problems. Nietzsche dedicates a few words to Napoleon, Bismarck, Caesar, and other political figures that featured in his published works. He is decidedly more nuanced on Napoleon in this work, in the more Christian and Schopenhauerian interpretation of his role in world history, namely as a conqueror among conquerors, a spiller of blood, who ultimately did not amount to much because it's not this world that matters, but the next. But that's not the main thing. Nietzsche was more or less apolitical in his published works, except scant references to German culture in general or some shade thrown at Bismarck and such. And he harped on socialists and anarchists a few times in Twilight of the Idols. But the point is, politics were never at the forefront of his philosophy. What happens in this book is not really a complete reversal of that trend, but an entire chapter is basically dedicated to politics. It just doesn't seem like something Nietzsche would really want to do. He thought culture was much more important than politics, which is, after all, just an extension of culture. He disliked democracy because he felt he was an aristocrat at heart. His problem was not with the political system of democracy as a system, but because of the underlying culture of equality that lay underneath it. His problem was with culture, not politics as such. Aside from this outsized attention to nitty-gritty politics, there is a huge red flag in My Sister and I when Nietzsche discusses a figure that is very well known to us, but who probably was somewhat obscure to Nietzsche, and that is Karl Marx. There is no evidence that Nietzsche ever read Marx directly. However, it's highly probable that Nietzsche was at least familiar with Marx's works through secondary sources. Still, there is no mention of Karl Marx anywhere in Nietzsche's published writings. Instead, he refers to socialism, not Marxism. He also criticized the German labor movement, but Marx is never directly mentioned. There is no evidence whatsoever he ever read Marx. Now, it's certainly possible he has read him, but the lack of references to such an important world historical figure seems to be a conclusive argument on its own. If he knew of Marx's ideas, he simply lumped them in with the other socialists and didn't think of Marx as a particularly noteworthy individual deserving of explicit attention. All of that changes in My Sister and I, where Marx is talked about somewhat frequently. What probably happened here is a similar case to our Freudian example at the start of the book. The writer of this book was very familiar with Marx, as was basically anyone in the 1940s, and he simply forgot that back in Nietzsche's day, knowledge about Marx wasn't as common or widespread. There's a similar suspicious passage in the book where Nietzsche discusses the American city of Detroit, a city which, in Nietzsche's time, was not remarkable at all. Detroit only rose to world prominence after Nietzsche died, beginning in 1903, when Henry Ford basically turned Detroit into the world's automotive capital. It's simply extremely unlikely that a German writing in 1889 would care enough about Detroit, let alone know the name, to mention it in a book of philosophy. At this point, I'm sure the viewer has become aware of my personal bias. I personally believe that the book is fake, a forgery. For what reason it was written, I can only guess. For the artistry? For the money? As Christian propaganda? As a practical joke? In any case, forgeries like these are not historical anomalies. They have happened before. I base my case on three main arguments. The style, which is admittedly a subjective opinion at the end of the day. The unlikely story of the manuscript, which is also subjective as it's not flat out impossible, but above all, the gaffes and mistakes we just elaborated on. The sloppy use of the term subconscious, the mentions of Marx and the city of Detroit, and Nietzsche's volte-face on Christianity. But ultimately, it's up to you, the viewer, to decide for yourself. The book is available on Amazon if you're curious, together with a critical introduction that is well worth reading. There's a link in the description to where you can buy it. But that raises a final question. Should you read this book, even if you think it's fake? Is it a worthwhile exercise? In my opinion, yes. Let's take a closer look. First of all, even if you simply regard the book as a piece of historical fiction, it is a pretty good piece of historical fiction. Aside from the edginess I mentioned, the book has some passages that are simply captivating to read. The author really captures the feeling of someone on the brink of death, trying to deal with his imminent mortality. If you can suspend your disbelief, it's a fascinating experience to read the book and just imagine Nietzsche writing this down as a kind of alternate history, using his brief moments of mental clarity to jot down his final thoughts on life, being completely worn down and hopeless, surrounded by various prominent, important people who come to visit him in the insane asylum on the visitation of his sister, only to then speak about him as if he's already in the grave. But as interesting as these passages are, they are interspersed with plain cringy lines about how completely he changed his mind on the most fundamental points of his philosophy. You have to take the good with the bad. As a psychological profile of a dying man, the book is great. As a work of Nietzschean philosophy, it falls hopelessly flat. But if you go into this book with that psychological mindset instead of a philosophical one, you will find valuable passages here, and who knows, maybe even reflect a bit on your own mortality. The second reason to read this book is simply that the entire existence of the book is just so interesting. How many of you knew about this book? Let us know in the comments if this video is the first time you've heard of the book, because I'm really curious. For me personally, it took me years to realize that this book even existed. It's been relegated to the dustbin of history, because most people assume it's fake. Does that mean it's completely worthless, however? I don't think so. The book makes for good reading for any Nietzsche fan, which brings me to my third point. To those of you who are more postmodernly minded, this book might even grant you new insights into Nietzsche's philosophy. Even though arguments are mostly lacking in this work, this invented new perspective of Nietzsche's philosophy might make you consider the real Nietzsche's viewpoints in a different light. Rosencrantz and Guildenstern Are Dead is an existentialist play by Tom Stoppard. It rewrites Shakespeare's Hamlet, except that it makes Rosencrantz and Guildenstern, two extremely unimportant people in the original, the main protagonists. It's not a work by Shakespeare, but it can teach us something about Hamlet nonetheless. It's an artistic endeavor that switches around the main focus of the play. Here, Hamlet is an inconsequential side character instead of the main protagonist. It allows us to see the original play in a different light. The same can be said of My Sister and I. If we remain fully aware that this work is probably not authentic, we can still use it for our own purposes, namely, learn something about Nietzsche. For all the edginess and elementary little mistakes, it's doubtless that the author of My Sister and I, whoever he or she may be, had a good grasp of Nietzsche's philosophy. Good enough to convince at least some academics, by no means stupid people, that the work is authentic. Isn't it always worthwhile to read what someone knowledgeable about a certain topic has to say about it, even if it comes down to us in a forgery clearly intended to dissuade us from Nietzsche's philosophy? As an added bonus, the book is chock full of allusions and references to Greek myths, plays, and poetry. The author really tried to inject as much Hellenism as possible, with references to Homer abound, clearly playing into Nietzsche's expertise as a philologist. The author probably sprinkled in all these references to make people think that only someone as well educated on the Greeks as Nietzsche was could make all these references. But whatever the case may be, it's a fun little journey to find some obscure character from a Greek play and let yourself get lost on the path where these little allusions take you. Above all, the book is short. Written in short paragraphs too, which makes it very easy to pick up again where you left off. The foreword is also really interesting. It contains a few short papers of detractors and proponents going back and forth or whether or not the book is authentic. If you want more arguments from the pro side of the coin, definitely pick up the book and take a look. Again, there's a link in the description to where you can buy it. An unlikely story of immigration fraud, smuggling, insanity, a philosophical genius scribbling down his dying thoughts and desperately trying to keep them away from the hands of his tyrannical sister. Reflections on mortality, politics, Christianity, love, and women. An English manuscript without a German original. An obscure little work surfacing 50 years after the demise of one of philosophy's most recognizable faces. Explosive claims about incestuous relationships and sexual disappointments. That is the story of My Sister and I, the fake Nietzsche book that quickly took the world by storm in 1951 and was then just as quickly forgotten. Is the book real? Probably not. Is it worth reading? Probably yes. As always, it's up to you to make that decision. And as always, thank you for watching. If you want more Nietzsche, there is more content on the way. Please subscribe if you don't want to miss these videos, and leave a like if you've learned something in this video. It really helps out the channel a great deal. A massive thank you goes out to our Patreons who keep the channel alive with their generous support. Over at Patreon, we sometimes post exclusive video content not found on YouTube. Support the work we do by joining us over there. If you've made it this far into the video, a sincere thank you. This video took a long while to make and took lots of research. We also want to thank NordPass for sponsoring us. Again, thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.